My fellow discussants, speaker here, engineer Shoten, and all other distinguished persons on the high table, very distinguished persons here. It is my honor to be here to share with you a little bit in this area, and I'm very, very honored to have been invited to speak. And I won't take too much of your time, but I'm very happy to speak about this topic. I'll say a little bit about myself. First of all, I'm not a consulting lecturer. I've actually been in academia all my life. And I'm a lawyer, I'm an energy lawyer, and I've been in it for quite a long time, specialized in the area of energy law and petroleum law. I've also been very, very involved in the PIB work because I was part of the Oil and Gas Sector Implementation Committee set up in the year 2000, first under Dr. Lukman. And we came up with, we are the original draftspersons of the Petroleum Industry Bill. The OGIC worked under Dr. Lukman, then worked under Dr. Galpon until the end of the Obasanjo regime. In 2007, when President Yar'Adua came in, he recognized the necessity for reform and he set up a new OGIC. He brought in Dr. Rewan Lukman as presidential advisor. And there were a handful of us that were in the old OGIC that Dr. Lukman brought in again. And I was in that new OGIC, which was a presidential committee. And we came up with, I was the chairperson of the Legal and Regulatory Subcommittee. And so we drafted the Petroleum Industry Bill that was submitted in 2008 to the National Assembly by President Yar'Adua. So I have been involved in it from the onset. The first rudimentary draft under Dr. Dalpolo was again under a subcommittee that I chaired. And the draft that actually made it to becoming a bill was also the product of the larger OGIC, and it was under a subcommittee that I again chaired. Then, after Dr. Lukman at a point became Minister of Petroleum Resources, and because I've been involved in reform a lot, he asked me to come in, so I was in NNPC as the secretary to the corporation and the legal advisor. And I was there for like 2.5 years. And then I'm out. I was on leave of absence from the university. So that's just a brief introduction. And I think what I'm doing, a lot of what I'm doing is talking about the process. I saw the name that you gave me, but you will see that I put a telling question mark there. There's some things I will say obviously, and there's some things that I will not say obviously. But maybe when we discuss, when we discuss, some other things might become clearer. But whether or not we do have a new phase is very, very questionable. Now, I'm basically just going to first talk about the reform because I think it's very necessary for us to understand certain things. We cannot look at a bill in isolation. It is necessary to know where it's coming from, and it's also necessary for us to know the direction that we want it to go to. And so this is more or less my sequence. I'm talking about the petroleum industry reform, I'm talking about the current state of the downstream, I'm talking about the downstream under this petroleum industry bill. And then the other last 2 points are basically discussion points for us, because I think a lot of that has to come from you. I see the downstream group as being one that is vitally interested in this area. I am myself extremely interested in this area because I am a person who approaches energy law from the perspective of the international economic lawyer and the person that is concerned with development issues. And I'm so aware of the fact that no country can develop with a comatose or a stagnant or a collapsing downstream. The downstream is all about development, far more than the upstream. I always say that the upstream is about making money, but the downstream is about development. Now, the first thing I want to emphasize is that reform is absolutely essential. There is absolute need for reform, and this was something that was recognized in the National Oil and Gas Policy that took several years to come out. It was the major achievement of the first OGIC in the Obasanjo era, but it was actually adopted during the tenure of President Obasanjo. And essentially, it first starts off by talking about the need for reform. It became obvious that the structures that had been designed, the structures that we had, couldn't cater for a contemporary Nigerian oil and gas industry. And it gave different examples. One example here is the fact that the Petroleum Industry Act, it was very old, and I mean, this was written some time ago. The Petroleum Industry Act is still the act that operates in the industry. This is now well over 40 years. So it talked about that. It also talked about the NNPC Act being outdated. It talked about the fact that the laws, not only were they outdated, but they were all over the place. They were found in several pieces of legislation. And then they said, and I'm reading now, this is coupled with the fact that the numerous amendments, policy statements, and regulations are dispersed in several documents and are often difficult to locate. And this is true because I remember in my earlier years often having to sit down to look for an amendment, because particularly during the days of the military, there would be an amendment, and since essentially the military government is not about the rule of law or about complying with regulations or laws, you find that an amendment will be made and then it will be dumped somewhere. So there was even the problem of being able to ascertain and to get what the law was. Now, as well, the policy now says some things about the Ministry of Petroleum. It said that it remains essentially a civil service outfit that is ill-equipped to conceive and formulate the required policies for such a complicated and complex and sophisticated industry. The regulatory body, the Department of Petroleum Resources, is by and large seemingly constrained by being a body tucked away within the ministry. Again, this is an obvious fact. Anybody who talks with the Department of Petroleum Resources, people there, or who even interacts, will know that this is a body that just has not been empowered to fulfill its functions as the industry regulator. It's not empowered with personnel, it's not empowered with equipment, it's not empowered with money. However, the major problem is the National Oil Company, the NNPC, and this was something that was clearly evident to us from the onset when we started reform. The NNPC, it is simply a typical state institution that operates as a huge amorphous cost center with little or no sensitivity to the bottom line. The words of the policy, and not my words, but again, very, very true words. And we'll find that till now that is so. So that you'll find that even if one looks in the downstream without mentioning particular concerns, you'll find that downstream businesses that private sector people are making money from, NNPC is making severe losses from, PPMC severe loss making, NNPC retail severe loss making. So these were problems that were captured in the policy. And so the policy now came up with this vision statement. This is to maximize the net economic benefits to the nation from our oil and gas resources while meeting the nation's need for fuels at a competitive cost and accomplishing all in an environmentally friendly manner. And it took us quite a long time to actually try to come up with this particular statement. I quote a lot from the policy because I find that nobody can find the policy and nobody sort of knows where it is. And I'm emphasizing that the reason why I'm emphasizing the policy a lot will be seen shortly, because it's essential to realize what you need to do to actually get a functional environment in place. And one thing you need is, first of all, to have a direction, a strategy or guidance. And ideally, the guidance should come from your policy. Let us say that the policy is that which is going to instruct the draftsman and let the draftsman know which way to go. If there is no policy or if there are no instructions, then the draftsman can do what he or she likes. But if the draftsman is not working in a coherent fashion, the result will be absolute chaos. So there were different policy objectives, several of them. I just brought out some that I think are of some importance for the downstream. Basically, there was a need to ensure separation and clarity of roles between the different public agencies operating in the industry. This was a foundational plan of the reform. The reform was to delineate and define roles. It was seen that it was very bad to, for example, have one institution like NNPC, which was not concentrating on its commercial roles, but instead was operating also as regulator. Also, liberalization and greater private sector participation were seen as being essential. Some more, maximization of the economic benefits to the nation, meeting the nation's needs for fuel at a competitive cost. This is definitely something that is totally within the downstream. And of course, the operations were to be carried out in an environmentally acceptable manner, providing for sustainable development and participation by the relevant associated communities. Another objective was the elimination of systemic corruption by increasing transparency and accountability and making system processes auditable. And this is essential for the upstream and the downstream. So, the necessity for the new law. The laws were outmoded, like I have said. Another one for the downstream legislative framework. It's undeveloped and insufficient. The result is that the downstream is de facto unregulated, frankly speaking. And you'll find, again, from myself as a lawyer, that is why it has been very, very difficult to actually come out and talk about the legal framework of the downstream, because you have a lot of lacuna, you have a lot of gaps, and that is why we are seeing some of the problems that we have right now. Now, reform is not possible unless you have got laws that empower and sustain or encourage desired activities. The law has different functions, but one thing that the law is customarily used for is to encourage you to do something or to discourage you from doing something. So if it is desirable for there to be certain activities taking place, the legal framework is done in such a way that there are so many incentives so that it becomes a pleasure. It's not onerous for certain things to be done. So, for example, if the activity must be licensed, you will make sure that the licensing is done in such an easy and transparent manner so that if for any reason a person is refused the license, it will be very clear. If clear why that person has been refused. If the conditions for the granting of the licenses will be clear. It won't be based on knowing somebody or giving something to anybody in a seat. So it's very, very important. That aspect is very important. The need for clarity, transparency, and good governance. Now, the law creates the administrative and enforcement framework for any industry. And it's important, again, for us to understand that if you have poor law, you will have a dysfunctional environment. In Nigeria, we really, really need to understand that. It is something that the late President Yaradua understood perfectly. And that is why he always used to talk about the rule of law. Because he understood that. That's one thing we don't really understand in Nigeria. So there's a bit of a tendency for people to say, okay, well, let them go and write the law, let them write what they like in the law, then we go ahead. The law is written so that it is to be obeyed, and therefore, if you see a law with provisions you don't like, don't just say, well, let them pass anything they like, we'll go ahead with what we want to do. No. Change those provisions within that law. Try and do your best to do that. because within a democratic system, I can draft what I like. But once I have drafted it and it has gone to the National Assembly, it's not my document again. And what gets passed depends on you and I and everybody, because the legislative process allows whoever is interested to have input, and the National Assembly people simply have to listen to the people. And as we've seen, very often bills come in one way and they're changed or something happens, and they're often very valid reasons. It is not true that the draftsman must know all, or whatever the draftsman has written is sacrosanct. I mean, I have been a draftsperson for the bill, for the earlier Petroleum Industry Bill, and I won't see any clause there is sacrosanct. There are some clauses there that you'll find that have been put in by the executive, but may not be the best clauses, but for whatever reason the executive cannot say something otherwise. The legislative process allows you to change the law to suit, to become that which you think is desirable. So the creation of an investor-friendly framework is something that anybody can be a part of. Now, this basically, I hope, yeah, thank you. Now, this basically just sort of explains, I don't want to take too much time on this because I often play around with variants of this, but I did not want to waste too much time. I play around with this because I believe it's important to understand the centrality of the law and the need for law to be driven by certain objectives, essentially. And so I'm saying that the petroleum industry, petroleum is the mainstay of our economy. We all depend on it. So when you see children dying of cholera or preventable diseases, a lot of it can be traced directly to the mismanagement of the sector. When you look at those classrooms with gaping holes for windows, a lot of it has to do with mismanagement of money. There's mismanagement in the education sector, but there will be mismanagement of money that should have gotten there in the first place. So we're tied to it. But in any event, for any industry or for any sector in the economy, there should be national policy development goals. It's not clear what ours are, but in most countries, you will see that. In Ghana has one clearly written, everybody knows what it is. Then it is from that the oil and gas policy should be derived, and then it is from the policy that the law should be drafted, and there should be complete compatibility. So, for example, if Nigeria wants a liberalized, investor-friendly economy, it should be an objective of the National Development Policy goal, and the oil and gas policy should be crafted in such a way that it also promotes investments in the petroleum sector. In the same way, the law that is coming into effect has to now therefore be a law that is investor-friendly. If it is not such a law, then it is contrary and it will create a skewed and imbalanced sector. It's after you've got the law that you can now be talking about administering, enforcing, or implementing. And what you are implementing is what is in the law. So if the law is in a mess, the supposed administration, enforcement, etc. will also be a mess. So at the end of the day, the law is a major instrument for the creation of the environment which you want, which is represented by the ellipse at the bottom, which is talking about a transparent sector, upstream and downstream, with functioning refineries that is not dependent on imported fuel. So that is what we're looking for. So the law is very important. That's why it's really vital to know what is in it. Really, really vital to know what is in it, because this area can become a mess. This is where we live, in this ellipse. And a non-functional downstream can make everywhere a mess. The non-functioning downstream is why we have no lights, why we run on generators, because if it was functioning well, the gas industry would be working well, and gas would be regularly supplied, and it would be supplied at a price that would be fine. All the distortions of the downstream leads to this perpetual supposed scarcity, and that again is a problem of the malfunctioning of the downstream. Now, I just want to briefly explain this because I find many people don't know. The Petroleum Industry Bill has gone through a very interesting process. Like the chairman in Genosage said, it went to the National Assembly in the year 2008. It was submitted as an executive bill by the late President Yaradua. And then it went through first reading, it went through second readings in the Senate and in the House. And in the course of those readings, it went through a lot of significant changes. Sorry, excuse me. It went through a lot of significant changes. Good changes, I have to say. Good in the sense that whether I agree or did not agree, the changes were in line with a prescribed process, a prescribed legislative process. There were hearings, there were basically, and many people submitted different memoranda. So in 2008, December, it was submitted. In 2009, it went through the first reading, second reading. The third reading, it actually didn't complete third reading for different reasons, and it was not passed into law. So what now happened is that the process now started again. Now, in other fora, I've gone into the story of the PIB, which is actually a quite detailed story of intrigues and whatever, but I think that maybe it's not, shouldn't necessarily be a focus for this. But whatever, the whole thing failed. The whole thing failed and it did not go through. So this time, there was a new minister, there was a new National Assembly, and in the interim there had been different surreptitious drafts and redrafts, purported drafts and redrafts of the Petroleum Industry Bill. But I think it's important for everybody to know that a bill is a technical thing. Anything I write will remain a draft until it is properly designated as a bill by the National Assembly. So I'm telling you about the process. Behind this process, throughout between 2008 to 2011, there were several drafts being done, drafts, redrafts. But this was the pure process, and it was generally followed, particularly by the Senate. But anyway, 2011, the drafting process started again, and the result is the 2012 Petroleum Industry Bill. And it is a marked departure from the earlier bill. Now, I've said that the bill that was submitted went through a real consultative process in the Senate and the House, and at the end of the day, there were significant changes made. But however, the downstream remained largely unchanged. The portion on the downstream, basically downstream products and downstream gas, leaned heavily on previous extensive work that had been done by the BPE and then also by NNPC. The BPE had a great interest in the problems of the downstream. The BPE was at the forefront of a lot of reform during the Obasanjo era. And they had done a lot of work. They had different consultants, they had different draft bills that tried to create a downstream that was investor-friendly, transparent, and very, very functional and detailed. It was very, very detailed, but it was functional, it was easy to read. This was the framework that was adapted and was put basically into the Petroleum Industry Bill that President Yaradua submitted. And it was good, so it was barely changed at all. It stayed throughout up until 2011. The same thing happened with natural gas. The idea was to create a natural gas framework that, again, was investor-friendly and that operated in line with principles of good governance. The natural gas clauses of the original bill were taken largely from the downstream gas work that was being pushed and encouraged and coordinated by the NNPC. And they had thought in terms of a downstream gas act. So what we did was incorporate the different gas provisions, which were also very good, into the bill. And that also stayed all the way until 2011. It also provided for an open, transparent, and non-discriminatory licensing system, operating in line with clearly defined principles of open third-party access. It provided as well that the network system would be taken out and put under a network operator, a transport logistics company, and those who were in the market would be able to utilize this network. And if for any reason there was a problem with the integrity of the network, then the network facility manager, who would be different from the owner of the network, would reimburse. And that is what I mentioned here, the different networks. So there was to be the gas transmission network, and there was to be the network for the products. So they were both to pass from NNPC. They are currently NNPC, under NNPC. You know that our whole downstream network is under PPMC. The network is totally comatose. The pipeline system is in a big mess. The depots are in a horrible, horrible mess. So we really depend on our numerous private depots. The gas transmission network is with the NGC. It's not as developed as it should be. So the preparation, the idea behind the law was that these would be transferred to the logistics company, and then they'd be issued to a gas facility management company. And then this again explains open access, essentially, whereby everybody utilizes the facilities in accordance with commercially viable terms, and contracted capacity is based on need, and there should be no discrimination. All this is so that there will be a functioning downstream, and so that the different products will be totally accessible to those that need them. In the same way, third-party access is applied in terms of natural gas, basically allowing terms and conditions under which a third party will be able to come and access the natural gas network. And it was premised on the need to provide for a framework that stimulates the gas industry, particularly for domestic consumption. You know that we are trying to concentrate, Nigeria ostensibly is trying to concentrate on ensuring that natural gas is used within Nigeria so as to push and jumpstart the downstream. However, presently there isn't much clarity in these two areas, as we will see. So now, I think this, to be frank and sincere, is just probably the pictorial way in which I'll illustrate what happened between 2007 to 2011. Now, the illusion is represented by the pillars going up. Essentially, there was a PIB submitted. Essentially, after that, there were various drafts being done in between that muddied the water. Unfortunately, the brown pillar is not clear. I should have made it a bit lighter. Maybe I'll do that if they haven't done the different photocopies, so that it'll be clearer. And then the bill, in the meantime, the bill was going on, and then the House and Senate PIB appeared to be a third reading. They actually started a third reading, but everything fizzled out. The National Assembly, for whatever reason, was not interested in pushing the PIB anymore. So it looked as if we were going forward, but actually the truth is that we didn't go anywhere. 2007 to 2011, we went absolutely nowhere. So the reality is actually represented by that arrow right back to base. So there's no passage, no PIB. That's what happened. So now we have our present framework right now. The present downstream. The present downstream basically has a Ministry of Petroleum Resources. As a ministry, an environmental lawyer, I kind of put the Ministry of the Environment in the corner. It is there, but we have problems of how to reconcile what they should be doing, because I believe they should be playing stronger roles, but that is outside what we're talking about. And then we have the PPPRE, which was not under the minister, but was under the presidency, but has been under the minister for the past year or two. There, we have it there as the pricing importation scheduler. We have NNPC there as regulator, trader, and pipeline stroke depot operator, having the Nigerian Gas Company there. Under it, having PPMC that has all the pipeline and storage distribution network under as well, and having all the refineries. Now, the refineries were scheduled for privatization until today. BP has got a power of attorney enabling it to sell the refineries. But I will come back to the question of the refineries later. So we have that. Then we have DPR as the industry regulator there. I just put it separately, but actually because it's a department, it's actually de facto part of the minister's office. And then you have the equalizer and the one that pays the stabilization funds, the Petroleum Equalization Fund. So roughly speaking, that's those are the institutions. And then you have the general public at the bottom. Then you have the products importers, the private depot owners, etc. And though I put them down there, it's because they're not institutional, but they actually play a very, very, very strong role right now. Because, like I say, the depot system, that is the government, is actually not functioning as it should. The problem we have, a major problem we have, is again that we continue to rely on imported products, which is a big problem. If one goes by the report of the ad hoc committee of the House of Representatives on fuel subsidy, for example, you'll find that where they're talking about DPK, they say we produce 5.61, but we consume 10 million liters per day. There's a shortfall. In the area of PMS, which is our fuel for cars, 13.83 is what we produce internally. We consume 40 million per day, according to them. So that huge shortfall is met by importation, which has been great big business. And that's the same, that we find. It's just in the area of LPG that you see that, very funnily, and I question those statistics very much, because they say that we produce a lot more LPG than we actually consume. But I wonder about that. But I think there's some artificiality about some of these figures, because maybe some of the figures are to justify the current exportation. The area of PMS, again, according to the statistics, a little bit like 4% is used as residential and the rest is transportation. Again, I question these figures very much, but those are the figures so I question this, because if people walk around a little bit and you go around the homes of ordinary Nigerians or even the villages, you find those tiny petrol generators, a lot of them all over the place. And I just wonder, but a lot of these things are outside the numbers. They exist outside in the informal sector. I think if all those things were taken into consideration, you'll find that the residential use will actually be a little bit more, because practically everybody has at least a generator in Nigeria if they want to do anything. And those little ones called I Better Pass My Neighbor, they run on PMS. So you can see, if you look at some of these graphs and you think of it, you can see some of the problems. Then you look at DPK, kerosene, and you can see a huge problem why there will be so much corruption and opaqueness, for want of a better word, in the area of kero. Because on the one hand, the poor are using it. Kerosene is the fuel of the urban poor, or the poor in the villages that want to rise a little bit, climb up the energy ladder and stop using firewood. At the same time, that same DPK is what is being used for aviation fuel. And who goes in planes? Clearly it is those who are in the higher reaches of society. You can already see that just that column opens up to all the nonsense, and the Kero business is fraught with fraud. There's a lot of fraud there. So you look again, you see AGO as well. What does the AGO products consumption tell us? It tells us that our energy is in a mess, that we don't have light in the first place, because otherwise, what am I or what are all of you doing with AGO in the first place, really? It's so much, residential use of AGO is so much because the electricity situation is so bad. There should be far more for industry. So, it's good to look at some of these things a bit analytically, because they tell you some stories and say quite a lot about what is happening. So that is what we have right now. Will what we have in PIB 2012 change it? I don't know. So, basically, under the PIB 2012, what happened? In the area of the downstream, certain changes occurred. The downstream was supposed to have the network system taken out of NNPC, the pipeline depot system taken out, so that it would stand separately. That isn't happening anymore. It's still staying in. So within the PIB 2012, we have the Minister of Petroleum as the head. We have one little office called the Petroleum Technical Bureau within the office of Lobby, so they'll know that it's a process that allows everybody to come in. So you have the President giving in the bill, you have a first reading, you have a second reading. That's the important part, because that is when they have the public hearing. So those who are interested, come with a strong delegation, give your memorandum, and probably sit down and lobby. It is what the IOCs did. The IOCs have not ceased to do that from the first time. In fact, from the time that they heard the word reform and saw that it might be seriously done, they have not ceased to close-mark the process. They were there throughout. They listened to anybody who would just mention PIB, and they made sure, and you can see their handwork. If you look, you can see that, yes, they have been able to stimulate some of these provisions. Some other people who have caught on to this as well, some other organizations who have seen that reform is in their best interest, and I think that applies to all of you downstream people. Reform is in your best interest because you will grow and flourish. People who recognize that have been following the process very much, but I have seen that very much with upstream organizations for the most part. And then, of course, at the end of the day, this is essentially the process that one is talking about. And I think that, you might have to think about what you want to do. And I think I will shortly stop at this point. I think I have just like 3 minutes to round up by myself. But I think that it's good to sort of strategize so that at the end of the day, there will be some sort of way forward and the arc will go up. Because there is the danger. It's very, very easy to find that instead of just having an arrow that is going up and reaching the end result, instead you now have that loop downwards, and you find that by 2015 nothing has happened. It will very easily have happened. It can be that no bill has been passed, or it can be that the bill in its present form has been passed. If it has been passed in its present form, it's almost the same as saying that there has not actually been any change in the status quo. And I think that that will be a big tragedy for Nigeria, because the downstream is very, very, very important to us, because we will never become a developed country as long as we have these comatose, stagnant and malfunctioning downstream. That is just really the truth of the matter. Thank you very, very much.